What if one of the biggest Viking advantages was not just their ships, their weapons, or their fearlessness, but what they were eating every single day? In an age when much of Europe struggled through hunger, weak harvests, and long seasons of poor nutrition, the Vikings seemed built differently. They looked broader, stronger, harder. In many places they appeared taller than the people they fought, traded with, and terrified. That raises a strange question. How could men from one of the coldest, harshest parts of Europe grow so powerfully when life around them was so brutal? Was it just genetics? Was it constant labor? Or did the Viking diet give them an edge that most of the medieval world simply did not have? Because when people picture Vikings, they usually think of raids, axes, dragon ships, and burning coasts. They imagine violence. They imagine conquest. But long before a Viking lifted a weapon, long before he stepped onto a ship, long before enemies saw him on the horizon, something else was shaping him. Something quieter, something hidden, something sitting in wooden bowls, hanging in smokehouses, drying in the wind, and simmering over fire. Food. And the deeper you look into what Vikings actually ate, the more surprising the story becomes. Because this was not a rich people's diet. It was not luxury food. It was not soft living. It was harsh, practical, and built for survival. Yet that very diet may have helped make them physically stronger and, in many cases, taller than so many of the people around them. But here's what makes this mystery even more interesting. On paper, the Vikings should have been weaker. Think about the world they lived in. Long winters, bitter cold, short growing seasons, dangerous seas, endless physical labor. There are no supermarkets, no modern medicine, no comfortable safety net. A bad season could mean hunger. A mistake could mean death. This was not the kind of place where you would expect people to thrive in body size. You would expect the opposite. You would expect worn down, stunted, desperate people just trying to survive. And yet the Viking world kept producing men who were remembered as imposing, physically capable, and deeply resilient. That is where the story turns. Because while other societies were surviving heavily on grain and whatever little they could scrape together, the Vikings were drawing food from land, river, coast, fjord, pasture, and sea. Their world was hard, but it forced them into a food system that may have quietly given them a powerful biological advantage. Start with the thing most people overlook first: protein. The Viking diet was often rich in it. Fish from cold, northern waters. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, wild game when available. Birds, eggs, even preserved meats during the dark months. This mattered more than people realize. In a world where many ordinary people ate thin porridge, rough bread, and small amounts of whatever else they could find, a steadier supply of animal-based food could make a huge difference, especially for growing children. That is the hidden part of the story. Height does not begin when a man becomes a warrior. It begins in childhood. It begins in the years when bones are forming, muscles are building, and the body is asking one simple question again and again. Do I have enough to grow? For many medieval children, the answer was often no. Poor nutrition in childhood can leave marks that last a lifetime. It can limit growth, weaken bones, reduce strength, lower resilience. In many parts of Europe, life for ordinary people was built around whatever grain they could produce and survive on. Grain could keep you alive, yes. But when diets became too narrow, too weak, or too unstable, children pay the price. Now place that beside a Viking child growing up in a coastal or farming community where fish, dairy, meat, and animal fat could appear more regularly. Suddenly, the picture changes. The difference is no longer just about calories. It is about nourishment. It is about quality. It is about what the body receives year after year while it is trying to become adult. And then there was the sea. For the Vikings, the sea was not just a road for raiding. It was a giant living pantry. Cod, herring, salmon, other fish from cold waters, shellfish in some places, seabirds and eggs in certain regions. The sea was often harsh, but gave back food in enormous value. Fresh fish could feed families. Dried fish could last. Smoked fish could carry people through darker seasons. This is where the Viking diet becomes more than just interesting. It becomes strategic. Because in a world where famine could destroy entire communities, reliable food mattered almost more than rich food. A steady food source could protect people from the worst enemy of all, long nutritional collapse. That is something modern viewers can easily miss. We hear fish and think of a meal. But for the Vikings, fish could mean the difference between steady strength and seasonal breakdown. It could mean children kept growing. It could mean winter was survived. It could mean the body did not spend month after month starving, shrinking, and weakening. And the Vikings were remarkably skilled at making food last. This may be one of the least glamorous parts of their world, but it was one of the most important. They dried fish in cold air. They smoked meat. They fermented certain foods. They stored dairy. They salted what they could. They turned survival into a system. In a harsh northern climate, fresh food alone was never enough. A people who could preserve nourishment had a far better chance of staying strong when the land went quiet and the snow deepened. Imagine a winter closing in over a Norse settlement. The sun hangs low. The wind bites. The sea turns dangerous. The fields are dead. If a society did not prepare, that winter could reduce bodies and spirits alike. Hunger would not just cause pain. It would shape the next generation. It would shrink children before they were grown. It would wear down adults before spring returned. But the Vikings learned to fight back, not just with courage, but with storage, planning, and food wisdom. Their survival foods may not sound exciting, but they were powerful. Because every season they prevented deep hunger was another season the body had a chance to stay stronger. Then there is dairy, the quiet giant in this story. Milk, cheese, butter, cultured dairy foods. These are not side items in Viking life. In many households, they mattered deeply. Dairy brought calories, fat, protein, and important nutrients in a world where every useful source of nourishment mattered. It was dense, practical, valuable, and for growing children, it could be especially important. Think about what that means. A child in a world of scarcity does not need fancy food trends. That child needs building material. Strong bones need minerals. Growth needs protein. Energy needs fat and calories. Dairy could help provide all of that. Combined with fish and meat, it becomes easier to understand why Viking bodies may have developed differently from populations living on thinner, less varied diets. But the Viking diet was not only about what they ate. It was about what their food allowed them to do. This was a people of relentless movement, rowing against rough water, chopping wood, carrying loads, herding animals, building ships, fishing in freezing wind, farming difficult land, hunting when possible, repairing homes, surviving cold that cut straight into the bones. Their lives demanded fuel. Weak food would not have been enough. Their bodies were constantly being tested, which means the value of a stronger diet became even greater. That combination matters. Hard physical labor alone does not automatically create bigger people. In fact, if food is poor enough, extreme labor can break the body down. But when heavy labor meets strong nourishment, the result can be very different. That is where the Viking body takes shape. Not from one secret food, not from one magical reason, but from a whole way of living where powerful demands met powerful fuel. Still, there is a twist in this story. You have probably heard dramatic claims that Vikings were 6 inches taller than everyone else. It is a striking image. It sounds almost unbelievable. A generation of northern giants towering above the rest of Europe. But the truth is more careful than that. The exact number is likely exaggerated, simplified, or stretched in popular retellings. Not every Viking was a giant. Not every neighboring population was tiny. Human history is never that neat. Some Viking groups appear to have been taller on average than certain peoples they encountered, but turning that into a single dramatic number for everyone can oversimplify the evidence. And strangely, that makes the story even better, because the real power of this story is not that every Viking was towering 6 inches above everyone else. The real power is that in one of the harshest environments in Europe, a people developed a food system and lifestyle that seemed to have supported stronger, larger bodies than many outsiders would expect. Even without exaggeration, that is remarkable. It means their reputation was not built from myth alone. Their size, endurance, and resilience were likely shaped by conditions that had real physical effects over time. Their diet did not just fill stomachs. It built frames. It protected growth. It helped people survive where weaker systems might have failed. And there is another emotional layer to this that often gets lost under the drama of Viking raids. These food habits were not created to build fearsome warriors. They were created to keep families alive. A mother storing dairy, a father drying fish, a household preserving meat before winter, a child eating what the family fought to save. That is where the Viking body was really made. Not first in battle, but in the slow daily struggle of ordinary survival. Before there was conquest, there was hunger. Before there was legend, there was winter. Before there was the warrior, there was the child at the fire, eating the foods that could get him through another year. That makes the story feel different, doesn't it? Because suddenly the Viking is not just a violent figure from history. He is also the outcome of generations learning how to survive in a place that punished weakness. Their food was part of that discipline. It was part of that adaptation. It was part of what made them hard to break. And when these men left their shores, climbed into ships, and met peoples living under different food conditions, the contrast could be striking. Wider shoulders, stronger frames, more endurance, more recovery, more physical presence. It is not difficult to imagine how such differences would shape fear, memory, and reputation. To people already shocked by Viking aggression, their bodies may have seemed like proof that these were not ordinary men. But behind that image was something very ordinary. Daily meals, preserved fish, thick dairy, meat when available, animal fat, nutrient-dense foods used with purpose, not waste. The Viking table was not glamorous. It was efficient. It was severe. And it worked. There's also something strangely modern about this ancient story. Today, people constantly search for the perfect diet, the secret food, the miracle plan, the trend that promises strength, energy, and transformation. But the Viking lesson is almost the opposite of modern obsession. Their diet was not about chasing an ideal image. It was about giving the body what it truly needed in an unforgiving world. Protein, fat, nutrient-dense foods, reliable preservation. Enough fuel to withstand labor and cold. In other words, the Viking diet was powerful because it was brutally practical. No marketing, no luxury, no illusion, just food that matched reality. And reality for the Vikings was harsh. If their food failed, their bodies paid. If their storage failed, their children paid. If their nourishment weakened, everything weakened. So over time, necessity shaped a food culture that may have done something extraordinary. It may have helped create a population that, in many cases, looked stronger and taller than much of the world around them. That is why this story matters. Not because it gives us a fantasy of giant superhumans, but because it shows how deeply food can shape history. Not just armies, not just survival, bodies, families, futures, a child's height, a warrior's endurance, a people's reputation. When we look at the Vikings, we often focus on the drama that happened far from home. The raids in England, the terror on the coasts, the battles, the longships, the legends. But maybe one of their greatest advantages was built long before any of that. Maybe it was built in the quiet rhythm of everyday life. In cold storage rooms, in hanging racks of drying fish, in bowls of dairy, in the discipline of preserving food against the dark. So did the Viking diet really make them 6 inches taller than everyone else? Probably not in every case, and probably not as neatly as the claim sounds. But did their diet likely help make them stronger, more resilient, and in some cases taller than many people living on weaker medieval diets? Very possibly, yes. And that truth is more than enough to change the way we see them. Because the Viking advantage may not have begun with a sword. It may not even have begun with a ship. It may have begun with something far more basic and far more powerful. A way of eating that matched one of the hardest environments on Earth. A way of feeding children so they could grow. A way of preserving life through winters that could crush the unprepared. That is the hidden story behind the Viking body. Not a myth of magic giants. A story of survival, of adaptation, of food turned into strength. And maybe that is what made them so dangerous in the end. They were not only fierce, they were built for the world they came from. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe now for more powerful Viking and Norse history stories that reveal what most people never learn. And tell me in the comments, if you had to survive on one part of the Viking diet, what would you choose? Fish, meat, or dairy?